All right. Hello, 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 ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to VUX World. I'm your host, Kane Sims, as always, and I am delighted to present our presenting sponsor today for VUX World. It is DeepGram. If you are in the world of conversational AI, voice AI, and you are looking for an automatic speech transcriber, automatic speech recognition provider, then do check out DeepGram. They do some amazing work. They've got incredible deep learning technologies. Their accuracy is very very good, over 90% in a lot of cases. They power companies actually all over the world. They power applications, everything from meeting room transcriptions. They've actually just released some new language models as well, so they now support French Canadian. We just having a conversation a moment ago about my pathetic French speaking, which we might get into or not. Also, increased support for Hindi and Spanish. The models have been updated to better support conversational AI applications. They've released new models for voicemails, for earnings calls, a whole bunch of stuff. So whatever your transcription needs, I'm sure DeepGram can help you out. So check out deepgram.com/VUX World if you are interested. That is deepgram.com/VUX World. Okay, on with the show, where we're going to be talking about designing enterprise-grade conversational applications. Our guest today, Celene Osiecka, is immensely experienced in the world of conversation design. There's often job descriptions that get put out there. And I know Ben McCulloch, who's a conversation designer, you may well be familiar with him, always complains and moans about the fact that jobs that advertise for conversation designers always ask for like 7 years experience. And there's very few conversation designers with 7 years experience because, relatively speaking, as it's now become a well-known subset of UX design, I know that there's been VUI designers for a long time, over the decades, John Bloom and Kathy Pearl and Lisa Folkestone and that. But as far as its rise into popularity, it's relatively new, and so there's not actually that many people that have a tremendous amount of experience. But Celene does. Celene is a senior director of conversation design at 24/7 AI. And welcome to VUX World, Celene. You're part of a rare
Thank
breed.
you. Yeah, great to be here.
It's nice to have you. It's nice to have you. So yeah, we were just saying there that conversation design is almost seems like it's really kind of like emerging now as a serious design practice. As I mentioned, it's existed for many years. Go back to the early 90s and people were designing conversations for IVRs with very rudimentary technologies, but now it seems like it's getting to the point where it's finding its feet as a serious design practice.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I remember not that long ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when we were posting positions and things like that, we spent a good long time figuring out what do we call this thing, because yeah, VUI is too, it's not voice anymore, right? There's a lot of multimodal omni-channel practices, so we didn't want to nail it down just with VUI. We played around with a lot of different titles. We had interaction designer in there for a while. And then, yeah, somewhere along the way, we turned it into conversation, I think conversational designer. And then, yeah, now it's kind of, I think, a standard now where it is called conversation design. So it's a lot easier to get people now that they at least know what we're talking about. But still, you're right. The experience, though, is limited. We can't get a lot of people that actually have experience in conversation design, but have different skill sets from other areas. We have a speech pathologist that converted into a conversation designer on our team, and there's lots of UX folks that have converted over. We had a video game designer on our team that convert. So they all have the skill sets that can be conversation designers. But yeah, I mean, yeah, experience-wise, you don't get a lot of people that have that experience for sure.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like, what are your observations on the sort of talent pool as it stands at the moment? Obviously, we've got people who are now beginning to be really enthusiastic and interested in conversation design. You mentioned a bunch of different roles that are coming into it. I've met playwrights who now conversation
Mm-hmm.
designers and all kinds of people who kind of come into it. But there is a lot of UX designers also who are now kind of looking at conversation design, copywriters and UX writers and stuff like that who are kind of getting into it. What's your sort of I suppose your opinion or your insights into the current state of talent in the conversation design space, as far as availability, level of talent, and that kind of stuff? How would you describe the current availability, I suppose, of talent in conversation design at the minute?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's kind of two parts to it. There's the part that's innate to the person, like, are they, do they have good writing skills, communication skills, right? Because you need to be able to communicate in order to build a bot that can communicate. So there's a lot of things that are kind of inherent in a person that I think are kind of mandatory for the role. And then there's lots of learned things on top of that, right? We have a lot of best practices that we can teach and learn. Um, and even the technology that we use can teach that too, right? So a lot of those things I think you can definitely adapt and grow. But yeah, there is that kind of foundation that I think we look for that some people have and some people don't. Where then can they think logically through a flow? Can they think, how do they actually have a conversation between two humans? Is it succinct, and does it get to their point across, and does it, do they communicate well that way, written and verbal? So if they have those foundations, and we kind of have some assessments that can kind of, judge it as best we can, right?
Mm.
Then I think, yeah, there's a lot of, I've seen a lot of promise there. You're going to people that would never have thought that, conversation design is a thing for them can easily be a conversation designer because they have those foundations, and then we add those teachable things on top. Whereas, even some people that might have been doing conversation design for a while, I sometimes find that they don't have those foundations. So although they have a lot of the experience, they still might struggle with some of those things. So yeah, I think really the talent pool is so large because of that. If you don't look at just experience wise, you have to have 7 years experience. So I think you're right. It's impractical to really ask that these days. But yeah, if you look for other things, I mean, the talent pool is really, really large because of those two components.
Interesting. That's a really good way of approaching it, to be fair, is thinking of it as there is talent and people with talent that would play very nicely into the conversation design role, and using that rather than saying, "Have you got 10 years of a conversation design experience?" Because I think then you're right, because there is things that can be learned. There's things that you can put on top of good foundations.
Right. And we're
Um,
learning all the time. I mean, I would say the best practices that we would have used a year ago are different now because
mm,
the technology is different, and, just the even user expectations are different. So our things that we might have learned a year or two ago, and especially 5 years ago, have definitely changed. So yeah, so
mm.
it's you kind of, all those best practices are definitely fluid. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I suppose. And then you've got the technology underneath it all that's changing pretty rapidly as well, isn't it? And that then has an impact on the design approach and things like that. And you've got new tools as well that come to market and stuff like that. Tools like VoiceFlow. Unfortunately, BotMock now will not be available given that it was acquired by
Mm-hmm.
Walmart. But
Mm-hmm.
you see VoiceFlow every second week release something new into the
Yeah.
platform that changes the
Yeah.
way that the kind of way that you approach things.
Exactly. Yeah, VoiceFlow is awesome. Yeah, they're
Mm,
nearby us as well. Yeah, and Braden and the team there do awesome things. Yeah, they're just really making it accessible, right? Their whole
mm,
platform is just now anybody can be a conversation designer, at least practice with it, and
mm.
work on that. So, but yeah, I mean, the technology is enabling a lot of people, and it's opening those doors for a lot of people that wouldn't have had that ability before, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. That's wicked. So how? So you're in a fairly senior position now at 24/7 AI. You've got a lot of experience in hiring conversation designers, finding the kind of the bedrock of talent that you can kind of build on top of. I wonder if we can just dive back a little bit into your kind of experience, because were you at 24/7 AI before it was 24/7 AI? Is that right?
Sort of, yeah. So I started with a really small startup. I think when I came on board, we had maybe 10, 15 people. We all kind of sat in a little room. It was really, one of those startup stories. But then, yeah, so we grew the company. We started to get, more enterprise wins. We started with more in the education space, and then we started to get more enterprise, like telcos and financial institutions. And we built up that company to be a pretty big player in the conversation design space. We were more made FAQ natural language bots, so they weren't super transactional, but they were more human-like, right? We would design them to still have human conversations.
Mm,
Um, and then, yeah, we were acquired by 24/7, so I ended up staying there. Then we kind of expanded our portfolio. Now we do, a lot of anything AI under the sun, really. We have chat applications. We have our whole bot suite. We have the ability to, we'll have a lot of IVRs as well too. So yeah, it's just kind of everything, a lot of how the customer experience suite plays into things and how AI plays into those. That's kind of our strong suit of what we do at the 24/7.
And 24/7 AI even also has live, like actual humans that do the chat escalation and stuff like that, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah, that's kind of one of the claims to fame that we have, is because we have the tech side and we also have the operations side. And we learn a lot from the operations side. We have direct access to the operations team, what their agents are going through, what works for them, what doesn't, what skill sets and tools they need to be able to do their job well. And then we can take those learnings and put them into the bot. So, if they're doing repetitive tasks or things that, they'll come to us and say, can you make the bot do this? Because, I shouldn't be doing this. So we just launched, for example, for a US telco, a pretty large feature around the bot is authenticating the user before it passes to the agent. So there's no reason why an agent has to authenticate anybody, because the bot can do it. It can either detect the user is authenticated, or it can ask the user to authenticate, and then we can pass that information to the agent. So then they understand, oh, I don't have to ask that. And they save time on the call. They don't have to struggle with the user. Security wise, it's much better. So it's a whole bunch of applications where, we can learn from the agent side of how we can make their job better, and they can, learn from us, in certain things. If we have a flow that's working really well and for some reason a user does escalate, they can take that user through that exact same process using the same technology that we're using for the users too. So yeah, there's definitely applications where having both sides is a benefit. And from a customer perspective, we're kind of end to end, right? They don't have to worry about, here's one piece of technology for the bot side, here's one piece of technology for the agent side, and for the chat side, it's kind of all one suite for them.
Yeah, and then you've also got the kind of, rather than like, we'll need to give you some technology so that your agents can use this piece of technology, but then we'll design and develop the thing, so we'll use this piece of technology over here, and then we'll integrate that onto this front end, and then it all kind of gets a little bit messy. And I can imagine that a lot more companies, I suppose it is horses for courses, but I imagine that there is a larger number of companies that just want to say, look, take it out of my hands, just do it.
Exactly. Yeah, we just started making an offering called a managed customer engagement for just that. Exactly. So if you don't want to do the design, the implementation, the testing of the tech, and you don't want to have, your own agents, and you don't want to train your own, we can do everything end to end as part of and it's just kind of one price for that, a cost per contact, and that's about it. So so we take a lot of the onus and the responsibility, the training, the risk on our side. And then, really, it's just we deliver that customer, this is what you're going to get. This is what you pay, this one price. So, it's worked out really well. A lot of companies have been interested in that.
Interesting. And what about your role then? So are you and your team working with clients to design the conversations, or is your role more around helping the team that you have do the work? Like, what's the scope of your role? Where does it kind of start and end, sort of thing?
Yeah, I do a little bit of everything. I think, I work, our team primarily works with clients directly, and helping them, either consulting them or building things for them, depending on how much hands-on they want to be. And then my role I span a little bit wider than that. I help, potentially consult a client of even what solution they need at the beginning. So, we're talking about a medical company that does COVID testing. So, how can we help them automate the process when they're helping their customers do the testing and audit the testing and things like that. So, we're talking about scoping a solution and how we can make it work for them early. And then I help the team build the solutions. I can either help the team with, if they need help with a client meeting or something like that, I'll attend the client meeting. Sometimes I'll get involved in the client meetings just to kind of help implementation best practices and get things, ensuring that we're meeting their KPIs and their goals. And then we also do optimization as well too. So we also focus on, after you're launching, what can we do afterward? How can we even further increase, to get you to where we need to get you? And then I also help, similar to kind of what VoiceFlow does, we do something similar where we have a lot of self-serve applications as well. So, for example, one of them is building the bot end to end. So we don't have to do it. A user could do it completely self-serve if they wanted to. So helping the product team make those self-serve tools better and more efficient. So it helps us and helps our clients too. So I kind of go between, I guess, those four different functions.
Interesting. That is interesting. And you mentioned, I mean, you've obviously learned a hell of a lot over the years, as we've kind of been mentioning. You mentioned there though that things now have changed compared to 5 years ago. Perhaps they've even changed from a year ago, 2 years ago. What are some
Mhm.
of the kind of examples? I don't want to put you on the spot, but have you got any kind of like examples that you could think of things that you've noticed that have changed in conversation design over the last, say, 18 months or so?
Yeah, there's, I guess, two big ones. I mean, I'm sure there's lots, but the ones that are just recent for me are one example is on the messaging side, on the digital side, and one example is on the voice side. So on the messaging side, we used to just really design for the web and mobile, right? It was first for the web back in the day, and then mobile came
Mm,
into play and designing for mobile. And now we're designing for asynchronous channels like Apple and Google, Facebook, things like that. So that's kind of changed the landscape of what a conversation designer has to do too. Because not only do we need to know the best practices for web and mobile, we need to know the best practices for every one of those channels, and they're all different. Like Google has its own set of things, and Apple has its own set of things. Like for example, if you're selecting, options, Apple had what they called a list picker. Google has chips. So everybody has something they call different, and now
mm,
Apple's starting to expand and looking at chips as well. So now we have to say, okay, well, we designed for list pickers, now let's design for chips and list pickers in Apple. So it's just their technology is constantly advancing, so we have to constantly advance and understand what works, what doesn't, what are our limitations, what are the best practices of the design aspects in all of those channels. And then the key for our team is that we try to design once and deploy across many channels. So
mm,
we're trying to design one flow, and then how can that flow adapt its content to all those different channels as well. So we have to kind of know how the adaptation works too. So that's been a challenge for sure, but interesting because it helps gain user accessibility. We know lots of more users have the ability to now have these conversations where they weren't before. Just async is a good channel to use, but yeah, it's to design for. It's challenging and tricky for sure. And our team is doing great to accommodate that as much as they can. Whereas I know a lot of companies more design for just Apple or just
mm,
Google, and they design different flows for all of them. But our goal is to design that one so we don't have to keep up 10 different flows for all these different channels. So
mm,
yes, that's one thing that's definitely changed in the last even 2 years, 1 to 2 years, is the presence of that. And then on the voice side, I would say it's just there. Uh, we deal more in IVRs, right? So we don't design as much for Google and Alexa and things like that, though it could. It translates to that.
mm,
But I mean, IVR is still prominent. It's not really going away anytime soon. So, but our goal is to how to make that better, and how to make it. I think users are now expecting IVR to work like an Alexa, for example. So they're so used to having Alexa in their homes, they talk to it, using natural language. They use the background noise before, you might have gone into a separate room to have a conversation with the IVR. Now they're just, in the middle of everything. They're on their phones, they're walking down the street. So how do you accommodate for the background noise and the natural language and the wanting to speak to it like a human, while still, and then advancing the technology to be able to accommodate that too. So that's part of what our team focuses on is how can we take the 20-year-old technology of an IVR and make it into a newer, more relevant application that makes sense that users are expecting. So that's kind of
mm.
a change in the last 1 to 2 years as well.
Yeah, interesting. And I suppose that, well, there's two, I suppose, knock-on effects that I could see straight away there. One is that you have a knock-on effect on your documentation and the artifacts that you produce, because you're not just saying this thing. When we say this prompt, we've got X responses that we're listening for. You're then saying, actually, in WhatsApp, this can't be very long, so it's going to be really short. On
Exactly.
in the IVR, it can be a bit longer. We can explain a little bit more. On WhatsApp, you might not get as many kind of like qualifying questions off the back of a prompt because it's easy enough to just respond with one, two, or three, or yes, no, whatever. Whereas in the IVR, it's a lot more open-ended potentially, and a lot more natural language and stuff being used. So I suppose I wonder if you can speak to a little bit of if what the knock-on effects are in terms of the artifacts that you need to work with. You're trying to design once and publish everywhere, but there must need to be some flexibility in the artifacts that you produce.
It's very true. Yeah. I mean, the designing for the digital channels and then applying them to the Apple, Google, that's challenging. But then a bigger challenge, I would say, definitely is designing for both digital and voice. Yeah, it's hard. So we always, I mean, use the concept of voice first, right? Anytime you're dealing with multimodal and things like that, we always try to say, the voice one is the most, I came from a digital background, but I confirmed it, but I think most people think that voice is the most challenging only because you don't have the ability for visuals. You don't have the ability for, those, like you said, the chips, like for example, you can't read, you can't go back easily. So how can we design a really great voice experience? But then what we try to do is then supplement with the components, like the digital components. So for example, the response might be the same. If we design for voice and it sounds good on voice, and like you said, it works for the other channels as well. Typically succinct and, a limit of, I think 60 words, we try to keep our prompts to, things like that. So if we can design well for voice, then we can say, well, if the user comes in, let's say on a mobile device, and let's say it's a hotel application and they want to book a room, we don't, we could on the voice channel give like maybe the top 3 choices or the top 3 hotels, top 3 rooms, whatever we want to do. But now on digital, we can add and send them a card that allows them to see, 20 rooms, and they can scroll through, see pictures, and then pick a room. So, but we don't want to rely on that for the users that don't have that ability or aren't eligible for that. So that's why we still do the voice first. But then if they're eligible, we can send them a card to make the experience better, to increase our containment. But yeah, so that's a challenge too, is how can you make these flows as similar as you can? They're never going to be 100%. But the idea is, how can we have as much overlap as we can to reduce effort, reduce cost, and increase user familiarity if they jump channels as well too.
Interesting, because it's interesting because I suppose on the digital channel, you've got a lot more guardrails because you're confined. You're basically, it's like a GUI, basically, isn't it? You're confined by what you see. you could ask it something that's not an option, and go that way. But the vast majority of the time on a digital channel, you can provide options. You've got more flexibility as well because you've got more capability, I suppose. You can send a carousel, you can send images, videos, web links, stuff like that. So then you're in, and we'll get into a little bit of multimodal. We'll maybe get into it a bit more later because I do want to come on to the other challenge on the voice side. But just while we're on this kind of like multimodal side of things for on the digital channel, because I remember seeing, it was recently actually, I think this week, Google released for Google Assistant, they released a vaccine booking capability in India. I don't know if you saw that, and the whole thing is tapped. It's Google Assistant on a mobile, obviously in India, the by far and away the most popular internet-enabled device, and Google Assistant access device is mobile, and the whole thing is a click. It's where are you? Click, I'm here. Where do you want to go? Click, I want to go there. Where do you want to be at next? Click, what time? Click. And the whole thing is literally just a tap the way through. Now on Google Assistant, you have chips and you have those kind of things. Same thing with a chatbot, you have those kind of things. But this is the first time I've seen a conversational interface be purely not based on natural language at all. And so where are your thoughts on where conversation design starts and ends? Because for me, that flow that Google Assistant has released isn't necessarily a conversational interface because you're tapping on options the whole time. There's no natural language involved. But I can see how those features, coupled with some natural language, make the experience a lot more intuitive, a lot more interactive. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on where that line is between what conversation design is and what UI design, or is it all just UI design?
Yeah, so I would say the majority, especially initially when we're deploying for a lot of our clients, we design just in that way. So we call it directed dialogue, using the IVR term, but directed dialogue. But we always allow the natural language component to be there because that's a big jump. I mean, it's simpler to do just directed dialogue for sure, but that's assuming that every interaction has a happy path, and that's not, in my experience. Users are going to get stuck, have questions like, well, maybe can I go here instead of here, for a vaccine clinic or something like that. So, I think directed dialogue will help you constrain and keep the users on the happy path as much as possible because, too much ambiguity is not good either. So having the options to kind of take them through a flow, if the flow is pretty consistent. But yeah, I think limiting it to just that and not letting the user ask a question or, even starting, maybe they didn't have that intent. Maybe they just have a question. They don't want to book a vaccine. Maybe they just have a question before they even start booking. So I think limiting that it's going to create, in that world, just you're going to have users that are not going to be able to use it because they still have questions and then they have to do more research before they go through it. So yeah, so I like a balance of directed dialogue works in a lot of cases. But like you said, blending in the natural language is kind of, I think, almost mandatory to have that ability to take a user fully through it and expand it to as many users as possible.
Interesting. So you were saying about the developments over the last few years and what's changed and stuff like that, and we kind of got into on the digital side, the impact is that you have more options depending on the platform. That then causes additional complexities when it comes to your design work, your architecture, your artifacts, things like that. On the voice side, a lot of what you were talking about was around background noise and stuff like that. So how much of your role and your team's role crosses into the technology side of things? So, for example, removing background noise, that kind of stuff, is stuff that needs to absolutely be factored into the design. Same thing with something like barging, for example. If you want to allow barging for certain prompts, not for other prompts, definitely is part of the design, but it's not necessarily something that a designer would actually implement. So, how much of what you do on the voice side strays into the technology side, or is that where the relationships with developers and that kind of come into play?
Yeah, it's definitely a partnership for sure. I would say because of the self-serve technology that we're enabling, we are able to do a lot more of our own setting. For example, we just had a feature that we can deploy and tweak the thresholds for confirmation ourselves. So we don't need a developer to do that. So, if this and this, do a passive, if this and this, do an active confirmation. So it's kind of nice to have that ability to be able to do my own tweaking. It does mean, though, that, again, now designer is becoming more technical and needs to understand, all these pieces and how all these things move around. But I like being able to do that rather than having to rely on a developer. But yeah, things like, for example, if we're noticing on one of our IVRs, we noticed that there were some background noise issues. So some of those things our team can't troubleshoot and determine. We can design repairs for them as much as possible. So our job is to make sure the user experience is good. And, the options are there if it does fail. But in terms of, making it, that it can understand through background noise better, we'll rely on data sciences or developers to work with us as a partnership. So so some things are independent, but some things definitely we need a developer, a data scientist to help us with to make it more, just a better user experience.
And I know that you kind of spoke a lot about in the past on other things that I've seen you speak at and things like that, and I know that the content that you contribute to and whatnot. The concept of personality design or persona design. I know there's been a bit of a debate around whether it should be called personality, whether it should be called persona, the role that it plays. I'm a big fan of. I tend to use the word personality now. I think it's after reading conversations with things from Rebecca Evernow and Dinah D. Well, I just call it personality now, I think. But I'm a big fan of creating a personality because I think it does give you some foundational grounding for your dialogue, and obviously if you're working with multiple people on a project, it helps everybody kind of get on the same page as far as the dialogue's concerned and sort of. But I'm just wondering what your kind of thoughts are on how you use persona or personality design in your kind of work and the kind of role that it plays.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I love her book. And when we were talking when she was writing it, we were kind of saying, well, I call it this. What do you call it? And, she would have 10 different names for something that we all. So, yeah, we all agreed that I think for right now, it's such a new thing. We all have different words for everything. And we just have to kind of figure out, what do you mean by entity? And what do you mean by slot? And what do you mean? And we're starting to standardize it. But yeah, I think we're getting there. And I think maybe in 10 years, we'll all be using the same terms. But yeah, so for right now, I've heard both persona, personality. I think, 10 years we'll be using the same one, 5 years even. But anyway, so it's funny. We did a panel discussion on, because I love the topic. I think it's interesting because one of my passions is just how can we make these things more human? How can we, which is scary, but also really cool. So I love talking about it. But somebody said in that panel discussion that you can choose if you want to create a personality or not, but it already has a personality, whether you want it to or not. So what you're doing is you're maybe tweaking what the personality existing is. So, if you create something, it's going to either come across as really too friendly or too flat or too, non-human like or too robotic or whatever. So even if you don't do anything, it's still going to have a personality. So I thought that was interesting. So, but what we like to do is, take that more into control rather than just letting, fate decide what our personality is. So, so it depends, right? Because in an enterprise level designer, we don't get a ton of flexibility. We can have some fun with it, but these are, we're dealing with airlines, we're dealing with banks, and we're dealing with things like that. So you kind of you can't have super, great, you can't have it be a crazy robot that will, tell you off if you ask it a question. Like Siri has like she's very saucy, so, can't do that as much. So, but at the same time, we can use it to our advantage. So when we had like COVID, for example, and people were calling into one of our financial institutions and needing to delay payment on their credit card, it's something that we need to be empathetic and understanding and help them through it, right? And we want it to automate it as much as possible. If you don't do that, then they're not going to feel comfortable with talking to this thing and want to talk to a person instead. So it's not just about the wording. It's about how can we make them feel we understand what they're going through. We're sorry. We're here to help. We're here to, defer your payment for 3 months or whatever it is. We can tell them that, but how do we tell them it in a way that comforts them as well too? So again, especially in the voice world, we can tweak now using TTS. We can have an empathetic tone. We can also just the way we phrase the concepts and things like that. So yeah, it's important to make sure you have that. And the tone and the personality can switch depending on lots of factors, what vertical it is, what demographic you have, what even intent, some intents are going to be more fun. Some intents are not going to be, you have to keep them very serious. So you can play with personality depending on all those things, just as a human would, right? If you came to me and said, I need to defer my credit card payment, I'd be like, oh, shucks, too bad. You would never say that to somebody because that would, so you just have to think of how you would speak to them in a human, and then you kind of apply that to your bot technology too.
Interesting. Do you think they'll become almost like a standardized personality in future? Because from my experience, over probably the last, I would say 3-4 years or so, most of the projects I've worked on have ended up with almost kind of a very similar personality. Everybody wants kind of like, even government organizations I work with, they don't want the bot to be totally robotic and like computer says no, but yet they don't want it to be like, howdy partner, how's things today? They want it to be like a little bit humanish, like, sense that there's something there, but not too robotic, know when to be a little bit, not tongue in cheek necessarily, but know when to be a bit more playful versus know when to be more serious and straight down the middle, again depending on the intent. So I mean, it seems to me that I don't know if it's just because of the projects I've worked on, but it all seems to me that there's a bit of a trend emerging, I suppose, when it comes to the conversation. You're obviously going to have brands like Virgin, for example, that are very much based on personality, or Domino's or whatever, who's going to really push the personality to the edge. Then you're going to have brands like I don't know. I used government, but this was like a local government. I suppose maybe like a centralized government, or like a pension organization, or whatever, who's probably going to play more down the sort of like serious sort of node. But by and large, do you think that there'll be a consensus, I suppose, or standardization of bot personalities, or do you think that it's just completely dependent on the brand and it's different every time?
Yeah, it's interesting because I get what you're saying, right? Because what we're being told by our clients is that exactly that. We want to have some personality, but don't overdo it, because then it gets too annoying. And I see that too from a user perspective. But I keep thinking, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be standardized, because again, I think we're going to be able to. I think where it's going to go is you're going to have custom personalities depending on the variables. So, for example, like one of the studies I read is that in order for elderly individuals to feel more comfortable talking with chatbots, it has to be more emotional. Like they have to feel and have really heavy emotion in that conversation. Whereas talking to a millennial, I don't care. Like, don't coat that. I don't need to be emotional. Just give me what I want. I don't care. I know you're a bot and I don't need to talk to you. I have a whole bunch of other things. So I think for that thing, maybe they'll become standardized in the sense of different variables. For this demographic, maybe make it more emotional. For this vertical, for example, government or financial institutions, make it more professional. pizza, retail, you can have more fun. So maybe standardize in that sense that each variable will have different types of personalities that we'll be able to invoke. But I think, I don't think it's going to be standard across every bot. I think they're all going to be different. And then we'll even be able to cut, because again, I'm thinking of when the best experiences that I can think of is when I'm talking to an agent or something like that, is not the ones that read a script. It's not the ones that are super bland. But it's the ones that, connect with me. Say, if I'm applying for a mortgage or something like that, and then they comment, oh yeah, like I applied for, something like that too. And this is what happened to me. Just like little anecdotes and stories and ways that can connect with them. So, I think that's going to come into play where, some users will want that and some users will not. And we'll have to learn and adapt to, if they reacted negatively to something like that, then don't do that again. And what, like a human would, if, they wouldn't repeat the same type of chumminess if the chumminess wasn't well received, right? So it's I don't even think humans have perfected personality anyway. So, we rub each other the wrong way all the time. So I don't think bots will ever get there until we can. But I think, they'll become more dynamic, if anything.
Interesting. That's it's very good, that, because I remember when we spoke to Zohaib Ahmed from Resemble. Obviously, Resemble create synthetic voices, TTS voices, and one of the things that he mentioned was that one of the call centers that they've been working with had created synthetic voices. It wasn't a conversational IVR. It was just a simple kind of recording for the IVR, basically. And what they did is, excuse me, I keep needing to swallow because I've got a cold and I've got a blocked nose.
Oh, it's okay.
So what they did is they created synthetic voices for a whole bunch of different staff. So as when you call a call center and you get put through to somebody, you might get through to Dave, or you might get through to Julie, or you might get through to whoever, and you're going to hear a different voice on the end of the line. They kind of had a similar approach to their IVR, which I thought was a really interesting way of going about it. So it's kind of similar to what you were saying there around, like, maybe the caller is younger, so you'll be a bit more playful. Maybe if they're older, you'll be a bit more, speak a bit slower or whatever. What are your thoughts on that kind of concept of sort of like in something like a voice environment where you have an actual voice, not just the words to play with, about, should a bot be a bot and every time you call you speak to Dom, or should a bot be this ephemeral concept of an agent that whenever you call you get put through to somebody else different every time with a different voice and all that kind of stuff? Or are we just getting ahead of ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, it does make it much more of a current environment, though there's pros and cons with that, right? As a human, I think, wouldn't I want to talk to the same person all the time? It's just the scalability nature of companies can't do that. I can't talk to my friend Anna every time I call in because she has a life and she may not be available then. So that's why I think there's all multiple roles when you call into a call center. So emulating that, it would make it more consistent with how the world works, but I don't know if it's actually what humans want. I want somebody that knows me, that I can relate to, that I agree, it kind of comes my personal assistant, right, for that company, let's say. The issue with that, though, as I've seen, is that as soon as that, and we just are so hard on bots and cars and anything, right? As soon as that thing doesn't do what we want it to do, or my computer, for example, if it's, restarts itself, I get so angry at it, and you would never do that to a human. So that negative emotion, if you had the same person all the time, it's going to stick. And they'll never want to use it again. If they call it, they'll just, zero out, give me a real person. I hate this thing. It's so annoying. So the diversity, I think, in that case might help. So if they had a negative reaction with person one, maybe person two, even though it's powered by the same technology, but person two might just feel better for them because it's a difference. So yeah, I see pros and cons with doing that for sure. Maybe when the technology is great and that, our personal assistant can adapt to us and our best friend and, never rubs us the wrong way, then we can have it the same. But until then, yeah, having the diversity may not be a bad thing for sure.
Interesting. Got a question from Richard Osiecka. I might have to read it because it doesn't all fit on there, but shout out to Richard. Does introducing personality to a bot risk making it too human? Does adding a human kind of personality potentially confuse users into thinking the bot has other human characteristics like memory and the ability to switch contexts? It goes on to say, which it clearly doesn't have, maybe character for the bot, like how a house might have a character, might make sense. So does introducing a personality risk making it too human and overinflating customer or user expectations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say 5 years ago, we were hesitant to add a lot of personality because of that, right? Because you're right. It's as soon as you start to chum and, tell a joke with the bot and things like that, then all of a sudden, yeah, the user thinks, oh, I can do lots of things that I would talk to a human about. So yeah, but now I think like the things you mentioned, like memory, ability, switch context, we can do that today. So we could even switch, like we had an example for something for an airline. So if you go down the path of an airline, let's say you say, oh yeah, can you rebook me on the 9 p.m. flight? And then you get a text from your friend, and then your friend says, oh no, I'm on the 3 p.m. flight. Then you can say, oh, bot, can you change me to 3 p.m.? Sorry, because my friend's on that flight. So it can do that now. So whereas, yeah, 5 years ago, no way. So you're right. I think the technology should come along with the personality. You can't just add a personality and think that this bot's going to be super smart. That's not where the intelligence, how users perceive intelligence comes from. How they perceive intelligence comes from, yeah, can you understand me? Can you do a task that a human would do? Can you have that, like you said, the memory? So those things, and I think are more important to have. Personality is kind of icing on the cake to accomplish what you want to accomplish. But yeah, if you don't have those things, personality is not going to get you there. So I agree.
Interesting. That's very interesting. How of the projects that you tend to work on, how many conversation designers tend to work on one project?
Yeah, it depends on how large the projects are, I would say. So we have a couple smaller projects that it's usually, yeah, one is just fine. And we usually partner, like we said before, with a data scientist and a developer, depending on, how complex we have. If we have a lot of integration, transactional stuff, APIs, things like that. So it's kind of a small team of like a developer, a DSG, a data science person, a conversation designer, and a QA, maybe, for the implementation team. But yeah, so when you get into start to have bigger projects, especially ones that are spanning across multiple lines of business, that have, huge volumes, that have just huge expectations or huge presence, and like we talked about, many channels. If they have a voice channel and they have things like that, the digital channels you mentioned, yeah. So then in that case, you might be getting into definitely two, or some of our projects even have three people on it. We'll have a more of a product owner role, we'll have more of a designer role, we'll have more of a optimization role, for example, for those bigger projects. So yeah, it depends on the size and what those clients are doing and how aggressive we're being with the timelines and things like that. But yeah, we have one client that we want to implement pretty much 20 journeys over the next couple months for them. So different intents and, big, massive journeys. So yeah, so for those kinds of things, one person may not be enough, because then we have to maintain it while we're building these journeys too. So it can be a partnership for sure. We have another project that one person's working on the voice flows, the other person's working on the digital flows, again, trying to make them as similar as possible, and they're blending them together so they work as partners. But definitely, yeah, there is that, because it's such a large project and has such small timelines. Yeah.
Interesting. So what are the sort of challenges then, I suppose, of having multiple designers in that instance that you mentioned there? One person's doing the digital, one person's doing the voice. What's the kind of either the challenges that might arise in that as teams start maturing and there's more conversation designers working on a project, or what are some of the kind of like, if not challenges, then kind of like best practices for working in teams?
Yeah. For one, I would say doing things together in a self-serve interface is better than doing things outside of that. So in Visio or in some other application, because yeah, those things can get out of sync so quickly. But if you have like a self-serve application, like what we use, or VoiceFlow or something like that, so you can all kind of work together collaboratively, I think that's a big need. So you can kind of see, oh, this person added this prompt here. Okay, I'll add my voice version here, but it's using the same model, the same everything underneath. So it's reduction of effort. It means that you don't have to be on calls with each other at the same time. But yeah, there's challenges there too. For example, how to divide up. So, if you're both working on the same flow, that can get really tricky, right? So who's going to design first? And, what if you disagree about a concept, and how are you going to work that out together as a team? So that's a challenge for sure. Sometimes we do it where, if we have, like, for example, 20 journeys to deploy, you work on 1, 2, and 3, I'll work on 4, 5, and 6, and then we'll switch, and then we'll, work on each other's. So yeah, lots of ways to approach it, but Definitely there can be challenges, overlap, miscommunication, disagreements, or inconsistencies through them. But yeah, the best way to do, I think, is if you have that self-serve interface, if you have a process between them, open communication, ideally in the same time zone, things like that, that it makes it better. And another complication is, again, if even 2 or 3 designers are working on one project and then the client or a partner wants to come in, which we have all the time, and help you, how do we how do we make everything work together, right? So knowing that the client isn't doing this 24/7, how, meaning, all the time, not our company, but how can we help the client manage that while also still making sure that the KPIs are met and things like that too. So then it becomes an education of best practices and kind of consulting as well with them. So yeah, the having other players in the mix can complicate it too.
Absolutely, I can imagine that. How do you approach, like, it's related to that. It's either having other people in the mix or those disagreements, because all of these things are around ensuring that the end result is of sufficient quality, isn't it? That whatever goes out to be accessed by an end user meets a certain standard and that we're confident with. So I'm wondering whether you can share some tips and advice for people on the kind of quality assurance, quality control side, like any things, processes, or whatever that you have that makes sure that whatever's created is of a sufficient sort of standard.
Yeah. So a couple things we do. We do definitely peer reviews, UX reviews, UX critiques with our own team. So having kind of a base of designers you can go to bounce ideas off of, to say, what worked for you? Is there any examples? So we definitely use our team to be able to do that. We also do, initial kind of focus groups, user testing before, usability testing before we go live, just to make sure, we're on the right track. Sometimes you can't do that because of timelines and things like that. So another thing is, if you have the ability to do A/B testing, love to do that. So if, let's say, person 1 wants to do it this way, person 2 wants to do it that way, deploy both and then pick the best one, right? And then, so that's an easy way to do it through data. If you don't have any of those options, then what we like to do is, and sometimes you don't because of technology or timelines, you can deploy it and then measure it afterward. So knowing that the bot may not be perfect that on the onset for the first couple of days, but if you're doing a regular optimization cadence every week, you'll easily see, oh, that's a drop off point. That flow is not working for whatever reason. So I'm going to listen to calls, or I'm going to read the transcripts, figure out where users are having the most friction, and then redesign that piece of it, rather than, spending all this time trying to figure out what users may or may not like before launch. Doing it with real data can always help. You just want to make sure it doesn't take too long to fix those things. It has to be a really iterative process, and the user doesn't have expectations that are set too high when you first launch. Calling it a soft launch, calling it, hey, you're the first beta tester to try our new bot, or something like that may help a user not be have that negative connotation with it. But other than that, yeah, we kind of use all of those strategies depending on what the situation is.
Interesting. And what about kind of like, so if you think about like design, let's call it graphic design, you would have a graphic designer. Like, I've worked in agencies in the past where, like, everyone who does the graphic design is all kind of round on these computers doing their work, and they know that the brand they're working on uses a certain color palette. They know that the brand they're working on has a certain logo, that brand guidelines dictate that it needs to be in a certain position or whatever it might be. But then beyond that, there's almost like different designers have different ways of doing things, don't they? So one designer might have a certain style, or a certain methodology that they go through, and that produces an end result that is on brief, but it's kind of like, if you were to put like 3 designed, I don't know, posters in a row, and 3 designers who've designed them, if you know those designers well, you might be able to spot them. A little bit like if you were to find, like, let's take 3 songs, and if you're really into music, like, let's say, for example, for those who are hip hop fans out there, if you take 3 songs, those that are schooled in hip hop will be able to tell a Dr. Dre beat from a DJ Premier beat because of the style that they have. They're both beats, they both do the job, but there's a style about them. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, from your experience of working with teams and teams of conversation designers, whether there is the same thing that is apparent in conversation designers, where individuals have their own kind of ways of doing things, their own little style and stamp, or whether it's more of a 24/7 AI has a practice and best practice guidelines, and this is how the company does things, and everybody uses that? Is it kind of like, do you see what I'm trying to get at? Is it kind of like a framework and guidelines and best practice at the high level, and everybody is in line with that, or is it kind of we're all conversation designers, we all know what we're doing, we all kind of get on with it, and we might have our own kind of bits of, I don't know what to call it, intricacies or nuances between different designers, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think there's kind of a blend of both. So, for example, we'll take a client's brand and the client's persona and apply it to. So that I think can change definitely how we word things and the prompts and the design there. But it always has the designer inflection, a little bit of the designer in those prompts, right? If we have a person that tends to be a little more verbose, the prompts will tend to be more verbose, or succinct. We'll see that succinct. So I think, yeah, your personality will always go a little bit in those bots, even though you don't mean it to be. But yeah, those the company will set and I think control most of that, because they pretty much have to approve everything. So that's another thing with enterprise. You're kind of at the whim of the clients and what they'll be okay with. But at the other side, there's a lot of best practices we know work. Like, so for example, if we are escalating, so let's say a user asks a question, doesn't have the right answer, the bot doesn't know. For example, there's a couple of choices you can do, right? Do you just hand them over to an agent saying, let me get you somebody right away, hand over? Do you make them try again? Or do you maybe ask them, do you want to talk to somebody, or keep asking questions, right? There's lots of different choices. So for those things, we know what works. So usually at that case, we'll actually recommend to a company saying, we really recommend, in this case, we typically want to go in the middle, the last approach where you ask. So we're not going to make the user try again, because usually it doesn't work. We're not going to automatically send them to an agent, because that's a bad UX too. But we'll typically say, sorry, whatever. In order to help you with that, I can get you an agent. Would you like to talk to someone now or later? So that best practice we know works. So we'll convince the client to say, because we've done so many different implementations, this gets you the best containment, also the best user experience. Let's go with this method. So kind of a blend of all three: client best practices, user best practice, or designer best practices, and then also our team has its own set of best practices that we know work too.
Interesting. That's good. That's nice. It's a nice kind of trifecta of allowing individuals to have their own kind of autonomy and creativity, whilst at the same time maintaining a degree of consistency that is reflective of the brand, which is sound.
Mm-hmm.
One final. I know we're overrunning slightly. One final question around: where do you see the future of conversation design heading? Like in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, however time frame you want to put on it. What do you think the job of a conversation designer will be in future?
Yeah, it depends on how the technology goes for sure, but just the way that technology has been advancing, I think there it will be a little bit more automatic. I think the technology will be able to be a little bit more, suggestive of saying, do you want to say this? Should I say this? Come more with things on the table. So we as designers don't have to dig and find all the answers and design the flow from scratch, right? So we can do a lot of machine learning based on past transcripts and things like that, where maybe kind of presents a designer with a flow that says, hey, based on past conversations, this flow tends to work. Do you agree? But just like with any right now, any machine learning, some things are like, wow, you're really smart. And other things are like, where did you get that from? Like, that does not make sense at all. So I think we'll still be involved, but more of a overseer, I think, than actually manually doing everything. So I think you'll still always need a kind of a person to kind of check the box or say, yep, that's good, no, that's not good, or again, listen with a human ear to perfect things. So maybe a bot will be able to build itself, but then our job will be actually listening and doing kind of that quality assurance to see, this is not a good experience, we need to revise this experience. So yeah, so I think humans will never go away, but I think we can make it easier for designers so we can scale and do a lot more things than just, spending hours and hours on one journey, for example.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting. Wicked. Well, Celene, this was absolutely unbelievable. I really, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, well,
It's
thank you
been
for inviting me. It's been great. Yeah, you have great questions.
it's been quality. It's been quality. I feel as though we left a bit on the table. We should do this again sometime. I know that
Yeah,
you're gonna be off for a while, but maybe at some point in 2022 we can do it again.
that'd be great. Yeah, awesome. Sounds
Nice one.
good.
Appreciate it. Thank you all for tuning in. If you haven't yet subscribed to VUX World, please do so. VUX.world/subscribe. I've also got a LinkedIn newsletter, which I don't know if you are familiar with or not. There's a few thousand people on there now, which is quite good. So if you are not yet subscribed to that yet, also do so. I would put the link in here, but LinkedIn doesn't generate very pretty URLs, and so it probably wouldn't fit on this screen. But just go to my profile and you'll probably find it there. Next week we are talking to Jan Sedevi, who is he runs the Czech University undergraduate group of students working on computer science, and they recently won the Alexa Conversations challenge, the Alexa challenge around social bot, I think it's called, where they designed a bot that can have a conversation for 20 minutes. So if you want to learn about that, please do join us next week. Thank you all again for tuning in. Celene, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. We'll
Great.
speak again
Thank
very soon.
you. Yeah, nice chatting with you.
Cheers.